Ever heard of a wild bobcat braving a blizzard just to ask a lonely man for help? On the coldest night he can remember, Elliot Shaw opens his door to find a wounded mother bobcat and her dying cub, risking everything, breaking every rule nature ever wrote. What happens next blurs the line between enemy and ally and turns one hermit's heartbreak into a story of impossible trust. If you believe even the wildest boundaries can be crossed by compassion, hit subscribe so you don't miss more stories that just might change how you see the world. In the pitch-black heart of the blizzard, the world outside vanished, just a wild swirl of snow erasing everything. Wind battered the windows of Elliot Shaw's old cabin, making the logs groan and creak. Nights like this always brought out ghosts and regrets. Elliot sat huddled close to the fire, its orange light flickering across his tired face, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of instant coffee. It tasted like ash, but he drank it anyway. Some habits, like loneliness, just hung on through the long winter. At first he almost didn't hear it, a frantic scratching, nearly lost beneath the howling wind. Another gust slammed against the door, shaking loose a spray of ice from the roof. Then he heard it again. Not a branch, not the cry of the storm, but something desperate and alive. Scratch, scratch. Then a pause, and then a raw, pleading yowl. Elliot set his mug down, every instinct telling him to ignore it. It was late, the storm was dangerous, and whatever was out there couldn't be his problem. But something about that cry pulled at him, straight to the ache he always felt when he remembered why he lived up here alone. He got up, crossed the rough wooden floor, and pressed his ear to the door. The wind carried the wild, sharp scent of snow and animals. He hesitated, just for a second. Then, steadying himself, he undid the lock and cracked the door open. The blizzard clawed at the gap. Standing in the blur of blowing snow, just a shadow at first, was a wild bobcat. Her fur was a mess of ice and dried blood. She looked huge in the storm's chaos, muscle, terror, battered dignity. But what stopped Elliot cold was how she moved. With her nose, she nudged something small through the drift. A kitten. Tiny, spotted, legs shaking, fur bloodied along its side. The little thing collapsed right at his doorstep, breath coming in ragged, shivery bursts. The mother bobcat let out a mournful, broken cry, a sound Elliot had never heard before. Her golden eyes found his, and in them he saw a fear deeper than any winter storm. Elliot couldn't believe it. Wild bobcats never came to people for help. They didn't brave fire, shelter, or the scent of gun oil clinging to his old coat. But here she was, desperate enough to break every rule the wild ever taught her. He knelt down slowly, his voice rough with disuse, speaking soft and low. "Easy, girl. I'm not going to hurt you." The mother tensed, tail twitching, but she didn't run. She stayed just out of reach, trembling with fear and something like hope. Elliot looked down at the kitten, so small, too young for scars, but already marked by this hard world. Its sides heaved, and for a moment, Elliot was back in another winter, holding his wife's hand as sickness took her from him. Helpless, powerless. He'd promised himself he'd never let that feeling haunt him again. Yet here it was, rising up in his chest, as strong as the storm outside. Another blast of wind made the kitten cry out, a weak, thready mewl that seemed to rip through the silence. Elliot's hands moved on their own, scooping the tiny body up and cradling it against his chest. The heat from his flannel shirt seemed to jolt the little thing. Its eyes fluttered open, startled, wild, but alive. The mother bobcat circled, her paws sinking deep into the snow, eyes locked on the door. She was torn, Should she run? Should she stay? Elliot took a trembling step back, beckoning. Come on. Inside's warmer. For both of you. But the mother hesitated. Pride and fear warred inside her. She wouldn't cross that final line. Not yet. Instead, she planted herself on the porch, muscles taut, every hair bristling in the cold. The storm howled around her, snow piling high against her haunches, but she did not flee. She watched. Elliot backed inside, shutting the door but leaving it unlocked. His heart hammered. The kitten was so light, barely more than a handful. It trembled against his chest as he hurried to the fireside. The warmth brought color back to its ears, but the bleeding didn't stop. He grabbed an old towel, pressed it gently to the wound, and dug his phone from the mantel. He scrolled through his contacts, fingers clumsy, and dialed. After 2 rings, a woman's voice answered, crackling with static. "Dr. Kim? It's Elliot Shaw. There's a bobcat. A kitten. It's hurt. Bad. And the mother, she's right outside my door." "What do I do?" Rachel Kim's voice was brisk, all business even in the late hour. "Elliot? Okay, listen to me. Don't try to treat the kitten like a house cat. Bobcats are tough, but they stress easy. Is it bleeding heavily?" Elliot pressed the towel firmer. "Yeah, it's weak. Breathing's rough. What if—" "Keep it warm. Keep it quiet. I'm snowed in, and the main road's blocked. Can you hold out until morning?" "I'll call the ranger, see if anyone can get to you. But it might be hours." Elliot swallowed. He looked at the tiny body shivering in his lap, the firelight flickering over fur and fear. The wind screamed against the glass, as if the mountain itself wanted to snatch this fragile life away. He glanced at the window. The mother bobcat was still there, her face pressed close, fogging up the pain. Her eyes never left his. Outside and inside, man and beast, both trapped by the storm. Elliot nodded, more to himself than the woman on the line. "I'll do what I can. For both of them." He cradled the kitten closer, feeling the fierce, stubborn heartbeat fluttering beneath the fur. The cabin felt less empty, the storm less endless, now that a wild creature had trusted him with its world. Why would a creature of the wild beg a human for help? As the blizzard raged on, Elliot knew only this. The night had changed, and so had he. The ice between 2 worlds was cracking, one desperate paw at a time. The storm never let up. Hours slipped by, each one measured by the steady drip of melting snow from Elliot's boots and the rhythm of Blaze's shallow breathing beside the fire. Elliot kept watch over the tiny bobcat, checking the makeshift bandage, adding another log to the flames whenever the room grew dim. Outside, the storm howled, shaking the cabin to its bones, turning the world into a swirling ocean of white. But inside, the world was very still, the kind of stillness that made old memories rise up from the shadows. Elliot sat back in the armchair that had once belonged to his wife. He traced the worn pattern on the armrest with his thumb, thinking about the life that used to fill this cabin, the laughter, the scent of fresh bread, the gentle tap of a spoon against a teacup. All of it gone, faded into the silence that had become his companion these past 5 years. He'd come to these mountains to get away. Away from the questions, the pitying glances at the grocery store, the friends who didn't know what to say anymore. Out here, the pain was sharp but clean, not muddied by words or awkward comfort. The cold outside matched the ache inside him, and that felt right somehow. Tonight, though, the ache felt different. Sharper, the bobcat kitten, Blaze, slept fitfully on a folded blanket, its chest rising and falling in uneven stutters. Every time it whimpered or shifted, Elliot's heart squeezed in his chest. He wondered if this was what fatherhood might have felt like, if things had been different, if he and Jenny had ever had the chance. The wind found a crack in the window, whistling through the cabin and making the old walls groan. Elliot shivered and pulled his flannel tighter around his shoulders. He caught his reflection in the glass, gray at the temples, face lined by years of squinting into the sun, eyes clouded by loss. He barely recognized himself. Outside, he caught a glimpse of movement. The mother bobcat, Sable he'd decided to call her, for the dark stripe that ran from her brow to her tail, paced the porch in tight, anxious circles. Her fur was crusted with snow, but her eyes burned with a wild kind of devotion. She pressed her nose to the door, then backed away, torn between instinct and desperation. Why had she come to him? Elliot wasn't a hero. He wasn't anyone's savior. Not anymore. The last time he'd tried to save someone, it had ended with a headstone on a windswept hill. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "What do you want from me?" he whispered into the fire. The flames didn't answer. Elliot's phone buzzed. For a second, he almost ignored it. But the reminder of Dr. Rachel's steady voice gave him a thin thread of hope. He picked up, thumb hovering over the screen, rereading her text. "Keep her warm. Watch for fever. Hydrate if you can. I'll check in soon. Hydrate, right." He rummaged through the kitchen, grabbing an eyedropper from an old first aid kit. Kneeling by Blaze, he dripped water onto the kitten's tongue, praying it would be enough. Blaze barely stirred, but a drop or two disappeared, and Elliot allowed himself the smallest flicker of hope. He leaned back against the wall, the firelight flickering across the room. Every creak of the cabin, every shriek of wind set his nerves on edge. Time thickened, stretching out like taffy. Outside, the blizzard whited out the world beyond the windows, erasing the line between earth and sky. Elliot's mind wandered, back to summer days, hiking the ridgeline with Jenny, her laughter echoing off the pines. They'd talk about the future, about the life they'd build, but life hadn't kept its promises. The illness came like a sudden frost, stealing warmth and color, leaving only emptiness behind. He remembered the day Jenny died, how the sun shone, mocking him with its indifference. He remembered the way the world kept spinning, even as his own had ground to a halt. After the funeral, the silence in the cabin grew thick and choking. Elliot had packed away her things, hidden her photographs, let dust settle where once there had been life. Now, as Blaze whimpered in its sleep, Elliot felt the weight of those lost years pressing on his shoulders. The blizzard outside was nothing compared to the storm inside him. He'd stopped reaching out, stopped believing he could help anyone, least of all himself. A sharp cry snapped him back to the present. Sable, just outside the window, her silhouette framed by blowing snow, stared into the cabin with wild, luminous eyes. She let out a soft, warbling yowl, a mother's call, fierce and unbroken. Elliot pressed his palm to the glass. For a moment their eyes met. Man and wild creature, two souls battered by loss, drawn together by something neither could name. Sable didn't flinch. She pressed her nose to the glass, then turned and vanished into the swirling white. He watched until she disappeared, heart thumping in his chest. He wondered if she'd ever come back, if she'd ever trust him again, if he could ever trust himself. The hours dragged by. Elliot kept the fire burning, dozed in fits and starts. Once Blaze cried out, a thin, reedy sound, And Elliot was there, whispering comfort, stroking its soft head. He was no healer, but he could offer warmth. He could offer presence. Outside, the storm raged on, relentless. Inside, Elliot fought his own storm, of grief, of memory, of aching hope. But as the first hints of dawn turned the windows blue, he realized something had changed. The blizzard would end. The night would pass. And maybe, just maybe, the ice inside him was starting to crack. The first light of morning was little more than a suggestion, a gray wash against the frost-caked windows, making the inside of the cabin feel even more like a world apart. Elliot hadn't slept. He'd spent the night on the rug, keeping vigil by the fire, feeling the minutes grind by as slowly as the blizzard beat down the world outside. Blaze, the bobcat kitten, was curled tight in the blanket, breathing uneven but hanging on. Elliot kept thinking about Sable. Through the storm's worst, he'd glimpsed her ghostly shape moving outside, never straying far from the porch. More than once he caught her peering through the glass, her wild yellow eyes burning with a mother's worry and a deep, impossible trust. The line between her world and his felt thinner now, the snow and the silence drawing them closer together. A louder, more insistent scratching pulled Elliot from his daze. It was dawn, or what passed for it in a snowbound forest. He rose stiffly, muscles aching from the long, tense night, and shuffled to the door. The wind had eased some, but drifts leaned heavy against the house. There on the threshold Sable stood, every inch of her taut with purpose, hackles raised, her breath billowing in the cold air. For a moment, Elliot and Sable stared at each other. It was a standoff, wild against human, mother against stranger, both bound by the tiny life inside. Sable took a hesitant step forward, her paws sinking into the churned-up snow. She looked past Elliot, ears twitching, searching for her cub. The tension in her frame said everything. She didn't trust him, but she needed him. Elliot swallowed his fear. He stepped aside, opening the door wider, letting a current of cold air slice through the warmth. "You want to see him, don't you?" he said softly. He couldn't help it. His voice came out thick with emotion. He kept one hand out, palm open, as if that could assure her that he meant no harm. Sable held her ground, head low, eyes darting from Elliot to the fire-lit room beyond. After a long, trembling pause, she stepped onto the threshold, but didn't enter. Instead, she circled back to the porch, pacing restlessly, her gaze never leaving the space where Blaze lay. Elliot shut the door gently. He understood. Sable wouldn't leave her cub. Not truly. Not even for a moment's safety. She would rather freeze and starve than take her eyes off Blaze. That kind of loyalty felt almost foreign to him, and yet, in some deep part of himself, he recognized it. He wondered if Jenny's spirit might be watching him now, and what she'd think of this strange, silent partnership between man and beast. He poured a bit of water into a shallow bowl and checked the first aid book again, searching for anything he might have missed. Blaze was breathing, but the kitten was hot to the touch, a fever burning through its small body. The wound had slowed its bleeding, but the risk of infection gnawed at Elliot's nerves. Dr. Rachel's last text sat on his phone. "Keep him warm. Clean the wound again with saline if you have it. No milk, just water." Elliot tried to coax Blaze to drink, but the kitten turned away, eyes glassy with exhaustion. He wiped down the wound with a damp cloth, working gently, afraid of causing more pain. Every movement felt too rough, too clumsy. What did he know about saving lives anymore? He sat back on his heels, watching Blaze and then glancing out the window. Sable prowled along the edge of the porch, her eyes meeting his through the frosted glass. A shiver ran up his spine, not from the cold, but from the intensity of her gaze. She wasn't just watching him, she was judging him, weighing his every move. Her trust was a fragile, trembling thing. Desperate for guidance, Elliot called Dr. Rachel again. The phone rang and rang, but this time she answered quickly, her voice tired but focused. "Elliot, is Blaze still breathing?" "Yeah, but it's bad. The fever's up. He won't drink much. Sable's outside, she won't leave. I've never even touched a wild animal before last night. And now—" Rachel didn't waste words. "Listen to me. You're doing what you can. Fevers in wild kittens can turn fast. If you can, try to dampen a towel and lay it over his body, but don't chill him. I'm on the ranger's radio. I'll get there as soon as the plows break through. Until then, keep him calm, talk to him, don't panic. He'll feel your fear." Elliot nodded, even though she couldn't see. He hung up and took a shaky breath. "Talk to him, huh?" He looked at Blaze, at the frail rise and fall of the kitten's chest. "Hey there, little guy. You've got to hang on, okay? Your mom's right outside. She's not going anywhere. Neither am I." He settled by the fire again, humming a broken tune, something old and soft that Jenny used to sing. It filled the silence, giving the room a gentler feeling than it had known in years. Blaze's ears twitched, and Elliot smiled through the tension in his chest. Outside, Sable sat pressed against the porch post, her eyes fixed on the window, her body a shadow in the soft, gray morning. She refused to rest, refused to be driven away by hunger or fear or even the promise of warmth. There was only one thing in her world that mattered. Hours crawled by. Elliot rotated between cooling Blaze's fevered body and stoking the fire. Sometimes, when he felt himself flagging, he would look up and catch Sable watching, her presence like a silent promise. As dusk began to close in once again, the storm relented, giving way to a deep, breathless hush. Elliot stood at the door, staring out into the endless white, his reflection superimposed on the world beyond. "You trust me, don't you?" he murmured. "You don't have to, but I'll earn it, I swear." Sable met his gaze, unblinking. Between them was a boundary neither had chosen, but both were willing to cross for the sake of the wounded, trembling life inside. Night pressed in, the wind picking up, and Elliot knew the hardest part was still ahead. Yet for the first time in years, he felt something like hope, fragile and wild, but alive. As he settled in for another long night, the fire's glow spilling over both man and Bobcat, the cabin no longer felt empty. The wild had come knocking, and Elliot had opened the door. The blizzard returned with nightfall, burying the world beneath a fresh wave of white and rage. Every gust rattled the shutters, turning the cabin into an island of flickering firelight surrounded by a roaring, hungry dark. Elliot worked in a tight circle, tending the fire, checking Blaze's shallow breath, wiping sweat from the kitten's brow with a damp cloth, and glancing every few minutes at the dark window, where Sable's silhouette loomed just beyond the frost. The air in the cabin was thick with wood smoke and worry. Elliot moved as quietly as he could, careful not to spook the fragile, wild spirit curled beneath the blankets. Each time he touched Blaze, he could feel the heat burning through its tiny body. The fever had climbed through the day, now radiating off the kitten in waves that made Elliot's heart pound with dread. He set a pan of water near the fire to warm and wrung out another cloth. The first aid kit had been emptied. every tube and swab and scrap of gauze used up. Elliot's hands were stained with iodine and hope. He'd never cared for a creature so delicate before, not since Jenny, and the responsibility pressed on him like the storm pressing on the cabin's roof. A coughing fit shook Blaze, a sound so small and weak that it barely seemed possible for a living thing to make it. Elliot froze, then leaned close, whispering words he hadn't used in years. Comfort, encouragement, the gentle nonsense talk of someone coaxing life where it threatened to fade. He glanced at his phone again. The battery hovered near empty, but Dr. Rachel's instructions glowed on the screen. Monitor fever, hydrate slowly. If he stops breathing, stimulate gently, massage his chest. Don't give up. The words seemed both impossible and essential. He tried the eyedropper again. This time Blaze barely responded, mouth clamped tight. Panic flickered in Elliot's chest. He fumbled for a spoon, trickling a few drops of warm water along the kitten's lips, praying for a swallow. At last, Blaze's tongue flicked out, weak but alive. Elliot exhaled shakily, relief as fragile as the life he cradled. Outside, Sable paced the porch, her shadow gliding across the snow, a silent sentinel. Every few minutes she stopped to press her nose against the window, fogging up a small circle of glass. Her eyes were fierce, full of longing, fear, and a trust so raw it unsettled Elliot. He wondered what she saw in him, if she remembered a time before fear, before hunger, before the wild demanded that every act of trust be a leap across chasms. The hours stretched on. The firewood pile dwindled, and Elliot fetched more from the porch, bracing himself against the storm to haul in an armful at a time. Each trip, he caught a glimpse of Sable, her breath steaming in the cold, her body hunched against the wind. Once, she growled low, not in anger but in warning, her eyes never leaving the door as he moved in and out. Inside again, Elliot wrapped Blaze tighter in an old scarf and settled close, speaking softly into the gloom. "You're a tough little thing, aren't you?" he murmured. "Your mom's tougher, I think. She's out there fighting for you." He felt a lump in his throat. "I know what that's like." For a while he sat in silence, listening to the kitten's labored breath, the wind's endless howling, and the faint sounds of Sable outside. He thought about Jenny, about the nights he'd kept vigil at her bedside, praying for just a little more time. He remembered the helplessness, the agony of wanting to do more, to save what couldn't be saved. Suddenly, Blaze's breathing hitched, the tiny chest seizing up for a heartbeat that felt like an eternity. Elliot panicked, memories flooding him, hospital monitors, silence, the final exhale. Not again, not this time. He reached out, massaging Blaze's chest with trembling fingers, whispering fiercely, "Come on, kid, breathe. You can do it. I'm right here." At first, nothing. Then, a tiny gasp, a shudder, and the breath returned, shallow but steady. Elliot sagged in relief, feeling tears sting his eyes. "That's it," he said, voice thick. "Just keep fighting." He cleaned the wound again, hands clumsy but careful. The infection looked angry, but not spreading. Elliot had never prayed much, but tonight he found himself mouthing silent pleas to whatever might be listening. Let him pull through. Let her trust me. Let something good come of this night. Time blurred. Once, the storm calmed enough for Elliot to hear Sable's cry, a low, haunting wail that rose above the wind and echoed through the pines. It was a sound of raw pain, a mother's hope slipping through her claws. Elliot pressed his palm to the window in response, a silent promise passing between them. Just before dawn, when the sky had turned from black to the faintest bruised gray, Blaze stirred. Elliot, half asleep, jerked awake as the kitten nosed weakly at his hand. He reached for the bowl, dipped a finger in water, and watched in awe as Blaze lapped a drop, then another. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A sign that the wild, stubborn spirit inside wasn't ready to quit. Elliot looked outside. Sable watched, pressed close to the window, eyes glistening in the pale light. He raised the bowl so she could see, a wordless message. He's still here. He's still fighting. For the first time, Sable settled on the porch, curling up just outside the door. Exhaustion pulled her down, but her ears stayed pricked, ever alert. The snow piled around her like a fortress, but she would not leave. Elliot stroked Blaze's head, his voice shaking with relief and awe. You made it through the night, little guy. We both did. The fire flickered low, the storm easing at last, and for the first time in a long, long while, hope flickered inside Elliot too. The night had been long, but the worst of the darkness was behind them. And somewhere between the human heart and the wild world, a tiny spark of trust burned bright, holding back the cold. The night had broken, but daylight brought no relief. The storm outside raged on, as if refusing to yield to hope. Thick curtains of snow buried the porch, and icicles hung from the eaves like the teeth of some ancient beast. The world was smothered, silent except for the crackle of the fire and Blaze's occasional whimpers. Inside, Elliot's cabin had become a lifeboat adrift on a white, churning sea. Elliot moved carefully, every muscle stiff with exhaustion and worry. The flicker of victory from dawn was quickly swallowed by anxiety. Blaze's fever would not break, and the kitten's strength seemed to fade as the hours dragged by. Sable never left her post on the porch, her fur now rimed with frost, her body shivering but unbroken. Every so often, she pressed her nose to the glass and let out a breath that clouded the window. Elliot made a point of waving to her, lifting the bowl of water, letting her see he hadn't abandoned her child. The woodpile shrank. The cabin grew colder, shadows stretching across the floor as clouds blotted out what little sun there was. Elliot's mind drifted to worst-case scenarios. If the fire died, if Blaze faded, if help never came. But each time despair whispered to him, he looked at the tiny bundle of fur curled beneath the blanket, and he pushed those thoughts away. He paced. He hummed old songs. He spoke softly to Blaze, telling stories from a world the kitten would never know, about wildflowers in summer, trout leaping in the creek, the way Jenny used to laugh so hard at his jokes she'd nearly fall off her chair. He remembered how it felt to have someone rely on him, and how fear could turn to hope in the space of a single heartbeat. A sudden clatter at the front steps made him jump. Elliot rushed to the window, wiping away condensation. The blizzard's fury had lessened, but snow still fell in lazy, swirling eddies. Through the haze, two figures emerged, one tall and broad, bent under the weight of a heavy pack, the other smaller, moving with urgency. Lantern light flickered in their hands, casting golden halos that fought the gray. Elliot threw open the door. "Dr. Kim, over here!" His voice cracked with relief. Sable sprang to her feet, hackles raised, ready to defend her cub. But when Rachel Kim drew near, she knelt, hands open, murmuring soft words in a language older than fear. The second figure, a forest ranger, face red with cold, followed Rachel into the cabin, stomping snow from his boots. "Heard you had an emergency, Mr. Shaw," he said, voice gruff but kind. "Let's see what we're working with." Rachel's eyes were sharp, her movements precise as she approached Blaze. "Thank you, Elliot. Most folks would have locked the door and gone back to sleep. She knelt by the fire, examining the kitten with gentle hands, checking pulse and temperature, peeling back the bandage to reveal the angry wound. The ranger unpacked a battered kit, antibiotics, sterile saline, a roll of clean gauze. Sable pressed herself against the window, her eyes wild with hope and terror. Elliot hovered nearby, unable to sit still, hands wringing the brim of his old cap. Rachel spoke quietly as she worked, describing each step. The fever's high but not critical. The wound's deep, but it looks like you kept it clean. Good work. He's dehydrated, so we'll try a subcutaneous fluid injection. She drew a syringe, hands steady. Blaze barely stirred as she slipped the needle beneath the skin, murmuring comfort all the while. The ranger boiled water, poured it into a metal bowl, and set it beside the fire. He glanced at Elliot. "You did right, calling for help. Storm's a monster. Took us 3 hours to snowshoe up from the ranger station." Elliot managed a shaky laugh. "Wasn't about to let him die. His mom wouldn't forgive me." Rachel smiled, warm and tired. Wild mothers rarely do. Outside, Sable let out a yowl, raw, echoing through the trees. She pressed her face to the window, eyes pleading. Rachel paused, then looked at Elliot. "Open the window, just a crack. Let her see." Elliot hesitated, then obliged. Cold air spilled into the room. Sable's cry softened to a rumbling purr. Her ears perked forward as she watched Blaze take a weak sip of water from Rachel's hand. The ranger shined his lantern, catching Sable's face in a pool of gold. Two worlds, separated by a pane of glass, united by need. As Rachel worked, she spoke to Elliot in a low voice. "Most people see bobcats as threats, but out here it's different. The wild's just trying to survive, same as us. You see it, don't you?" Elliot nodded. "I do now. She trusted me. Didn't have to, but she did." Rachel looked at him, something soft in her eyes. Trust goes both ways. The hours blurred. Blaze's fever eased a little, his breathing growing steadier. The ranger melted snow for more water, brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and insisted Elliot drink. Every now and then, Sable paced the porch, tail twitching, eyes glued to the window. Once, when Blaze let out a pitiful cry, Sable answered with a low chuff, as if promising him the world outside still waited. Elliot found himself drawn to Rachel's calm energy. They worked together, tending Blaze, sharing stories about lost pets, hard winters, the silent language of wild things. When exhaustion pressed on him, she handed him a mug and a smile, and the cabin felt a little less haunted. Outside, the storm finally relented. Through the frosted glass, Elliot could see the world remade, every tree bent under fresh snow, every branch gleaming in the weak afternoon sun. And in that brief lull, he realized something. He was no longer alone. The boundaries of the cabin had shifted. Inside, human and wild, man and woman, hope and fear, all had come together in the narrow circle of firelight and compassion. Sable waited outside, trusting these strange creatures with her world. And Elliot, for the first time in years, felt himself belonging, not just to the mountains, but to the fragile thread that bound all living things. The hours after Dr. Rachel and the ranger arrived felt both endless and far too quick. The storm outside was winding down, but inside the cabin, the tension had only thickened. Sable kept vigil by the window, pacing in tight circles, sometimes pausing to press her nose to the glass and peer in with eyes that seemed to hold the whole wild world's worry. Blaze, swaddled in blankets beside the fire, hovered on the knife's edge between life and loss. Rachel worked with steady hands, but Elliot saw the flickers of concern behind her calm. She checked Blaze's temperature, administered another dose of antibiotics, and whispered encouragement to the barely conscious Kitten. Elliot hovered nearby, trying to be helpful, fetching water, handing over supplies, and feeding logs into the fire. The ranger moved quietly in the background, packing up medical trash and watching the storm's retreat through the window. Dusk fell heavy and slow, painting everything in blue and silver. The air grew colder, the cabin shrinking beneath the weight of hope and fear. Blaze began to stir, his small body shivering, jaw trembling as fever pulsed through him. Elliot sat close, murmuring encouragement and reaching out with a cautious, gentle touch. Suddenly, Blaze's body seized. The kitten arched backward, legs stiff, a terrible high-pitched yowl escaping his throat. Rachel and Elliot froze for a split second before instinct took over. Rachel dropping to her knees, hands moving fast, the ranger rushing to steady the table. "Convulsions! Hold him! Keep him from hitting his head!" Rachel barked. Elliot scooped up the trembling bundle, wrapping his hands around Blaze's tiny skull and spine. The whole kitten shook, wild and uncontrollable, claws raking weakly against Elliot's arm. The sound, the pain, cut through the quiet of the cabin like a knife. Rachel drew in a breath, voice steady. "It's the fever, the infection. Sometimes the body fights back too hard. Just keep holding him, Elliot. Talk to him. Let him know he's not alone." Elliot's throat was thick with panic. He pressed his cheek to Blaze's head, whispering fiercely, "Stay with me, buddy. Please. You're not alone. You're safe. Your mom's right here. She's waiting for you." The convulsion went on, seconds stretching into eternity. Blaze's breath hitched and wheezed, his eyes glassy, legs kicking. Outside, Sable let out a piercing yowl, a sound so raw, so utterly desperate, that Elliot felt it vibrate all the way through his bones. The ranger stepped to the door, pushing it open a crack so the mother's cry could reach her cub. Rachel adjusted Blaze's position, rubbing his chest and neck, coaxing, "Come on, Blaze. You're strong. You made it this far." Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the seizure ended. Blaze slumped against Elliot's hands, his body limp, breath coming in shallow gasps. For a terrible, silent moment, no one moved. The fire snapped and hissed. Sable's cry echoed off the trees and faded into the frozen dusk. Elliot thought he'd lost him. He squeezed his eyes shut, clinging to the tiny, battered body, memories of other losses flooding his mind. "Not again. Not again," he begged, not out loud, but with every bit of will he had left. "Please, Blaze," he whispered. "Please don't go." Rachel leaned in, listening close. Then she smiled, small and shaky. "He's breathing, shallow but steady. You did good, Elliot." Tears slipped down Elliot's cheeks, hot and silent. He stroked Blaze's head, hardly daring to hope. "He's not out of the woods, is he?" Rachel shook her head, but there was light in her eyes. "No, but he's fighting, and he's got a reason to." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the window, but it seemed to Elliot that the worst of the storm had passed. Sable pressed her face to the glass, her wild eyes meeting his. He felt a deep, wordless understanding pass between them. Something about hope and fear and the lengths a parent would go to for their child. The ranger stoked the fire higher, and Rachel busied herself mixing another dose of medicine. Elliot stayed right where he was, cradling Blaze, murmuring stories of mountains and rivers and a world waiting for him outside the walls of this small cabin. As darkness settled, Blaze's breathing evened out. The kitten no longer twitched in pain, but dozed in exhausted, fretful sleep. Sable settled in a snowdrift just beneath the window, her body curled protectively, her head up and alert. She watched the humans with the patience of the wild, a trust born of desperation and something more. Rachel finally eased back and patted Elliot on the shoulder. "You kept him alive. Not many would have tried, Elliot. You didn't give up, and neither did he." Elliot shook his head, voice rough with emotion. "She wouldn't have let me." He nodded at Sable. "She kept me honest, kept me going." The three of them sat in companionable silence, watching the snowflakes swirl in the dark, each lost in thoughts of near misses and small miracles. The line between wild and human had blurred, and in that fragile space, life had clung on. At last, as midnight neared, Rachel stood, stretching sore muscles. "I'll stay until morning. We'll watch him together." She moved to the window, meeting Sable's gaze. "He's strong, like his mom, like the people who chose to care." Elliot looked down at Blaze, at the rise and fall of the kitten's chest, and then back at the fierce, faithful shape outside his door. In this cabin, for this one night, hope was enough to bridge every distance, between grief and healing, between loss and love, between a man and a wild, desperate mother waiting for dawn. And somewhere, deep inside, Elliot realized the impossible. Even the coldest night can't last forever. The sky was a milky gray when the first birds dared to sing again. The world outside Elliot's cabin was hushed, every branch glazed in ice and every snowdrift sparkling with the promise of a new day. The storm had finally broken. Sunlight crept through the windows, painting golden puddles on the floor, and for the first time in days, warmth seemed to reach all the way into Elliot's bones. Blaze stirred under the blankets, his breathing soft and regular, his small, battered body slowly uncurling, as if he were waking from a long, uneasy dream. Rachel, red-eyed but smiling, gently checked the kitten's temperature. "His fever's down," she announced in a whisper, careful not to break the spell. "He's still weak, but he's out of danger. It's time." Elliot blinked, heart pounding. He hadn't dared imagine this moment. He glanced at the window. Sable was there, pressed close to the glass, tail flicking back and forth, her wild eyes locked on her cub. In the snow, her body was a sculpture of waiting and hope. Rachel caught Elliot's gaze. "The bond between a wild mother and her young is stronger than any medicine. We've done all we can here. But he needs her. Keeping them apart any longer might do more harm than good." The ranger nodded, already packing up his supplies. "She's waited long enough. Let's give them their chance." Elliot hesitated. 1,000 worries clamored in his mind. Was Blaze truly ready? Would Sable accept her cub after the scent of humans and medicine? What if the kitten relapsed out there in the cold? But he saw the fierce longing in Sable's eyes and the way Blaze perked up at her shadow, and he understood. Some leaps had to be made on faith. Rachel wrapped Blaze carefully in the old scarf, tucking him close against Elliot's chest. The kitten nuzzled weakly, his purr barely more than a vibration, but his eyes were clear. Elliot moved to the door, heart thundering, and braced himself against the sudden bite of winter as he stepped outside. Sable shot forward, low and cautious, tail lashing with nervous energy. She kept her eyes on Blaze, ears flat, every muscle quivering as Elliot knelt in the snow. The cold bit through his jeans, but he barely noticed. He placed Blaze gently on the ground and backed away, keeping his movements slow and his hands open. For a moment, nothing happened. Sable stared at her kitten, her chest heaving with every breath. Blaze lifted his head, blinked in the new morning light, and let out a tiny, broken mew. That was all it took. Sable lunged forward, not with claws or teeth, but with a desperate, trembling tenderness. She began to lick Blaze's face and ears, the purr rumbling so deep it made the snow tremble. She nosed him all over, checking every inch, as if counting his toes, as if trying to convince herself that he was really, truly alive. Elliot sat back on his heels, tears stinging his eyes. Rachel and the ranger watched from the door, silent witnesses to a reunion that felt nothing short of miraculous. For a moment, nothing else in the world existed but the wild pulse of love between a mother and her child. Sable circled Blaze, then lay down so he could nuzzle against her belly. She let out a series of soft, vibrating chuffs, a song only her cub could understand. Blaze, exhausted but safe, pressed against her warmth, eyes closing in trust. Elliot felt a complex tangle of emotions, joy, relief, and a deep, aching sadness. The cabin had become a haven not just for Blaze, but for Elliot's own battered spirit. Letting go was harder than he'd expected. But watching Sable and Blaze together, he knew it was right. He had been a caretaker for one long, impossible night, but he couldn't keep Blaze from the wild that called to him. He reached out, hand trembling, and brushed Sable's fur. She tensed, then, miraculously, didn't pull away. For a heartbeat, wild and human were side by side, trust unspoken but solid as stone. Rachel stepped forward, voice hushed with awe. "That's the wild's gift, Elliot. You did more than save a life. You reminded all of us, human and animal, how fragile and how precious trust really is." The ranger nodded, scanning the woods beyond the clearing. "They'll have a rough few weeks ahead, but she'll teach him everything he needs. And you gave them a fighting chance." Sable stood, gathering Blaze beneath her with a sweep of her foreleg. She looked at Elliot one last time, a look so intense it seemed to burn through every wall he'd ever built. Then, without a sound, she melted into the trees, her cub tucked safe beneath her chest. Elliot knelt in the snow long after they'd disappeared, the silence filled with the echoes of Sable's purr and Blaze's soft mew. The world seemed larger now, full of things both terrifying and beautiful. He felt the ache of goodbye, sharp and real, but woven through it was something brighter, a sense of belonging. Not just to this mountain or this cabin, but to the grand, wild dance of life itself. Rachel placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Come inside, Elliot. Let's warm up. You've earned it." He stood slowly, taking in the quiet woods, the new snow, and the path Sable had left behind. For the first time in years, the emptiness inside him was gone. In its place was a fierce, fragile hope. Back in the cabin, the fire glowed brighter, the air alive with gratitude and quiet joy. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained, etched in snow, in scars, and in the bond that had formed between a man and the wild things who dared to trust him. The days after the blizzard passed in a blur of slow healing, reflection, and a strange, persistent quiet. The mountains, once suffocating and desolate, now felt full of secrets and echoes. Elliot went about his chores as if seeing everything for the first time. The way sunlight pooled gold on the snow, the restless tracks of wild things pressed into the white. Life, he realized, had never left these hills. It had only been waiting for him to open his eyes. The memory of that night lingered everywhere. It was in the way the firelight warmed the cabin's dark corners, in the hush that fell when he glanced at the empty blanket by the hearth, and most of all in the feeling, sharp and new, of hope, soft as Blaze's fur and as fierce as Sable's eyes. Elliot found himself replaying each moment, each choice, each heartbeat of panic and relief. He remembered the terror of holding Blaze as the convulsions racked the kitten's body, the helplessness of hearing Sable's cries through the storm, the relief that came with every shallow breath Blaze drew, with every stubborn swallow of water. He'd survived nights of loss before, but never a night so full of fragile miracles. One morning, as he swept snow from the steps, Elliot paused to study a pattern of tracks winding out from the woods. Two sets, one large, one smaller, moving side by side. He crouched, pressing his hand into the print, feeling the outline, the warmth that still lingered in the snow. Sable and Blaze. They were out there, alive, carrying a piece of him with them wherever they went. He realized, standing in the blue hush of dawn, that he was no longer just a bystander in the wild. He was part of its story, etched into the landscape by acts of courage and compassion, forever changed by the night when two worlds had brushed against each other and both had survived. Endurance. That was the lesson carved deepest by the storm. Nature was harsh and indifferent, but not empty of meaning. It taught that survival was built not on strength alone, but on courage, on the stubborn decision to keep moving, to keep hoping, even when all seemed lost. Elliot thought of Sable, how she'd braved fire, storm, and the unnatural scent of humans for her cub. He remembered his own trembling hands, refusing to give up as the storm howled, as Blaze's breath slowed, as Rachel's words guided him through the darkness. Endurance, he understood now, wasn't about never failing. It was about never abandoning the fight. Compassion. The night had shown him the quiet, necessary power of reaching across boundaries. Sable had trusted a man who should have been her enemy. Elliot had opened his door, his home, and in doing so had opened something locked tight inside his own chest. It wasn't just Blaze who had been healed. Elliot had been too. Compassion was not a weakness, he saw now, but the strongest force there was, a medicine with the power to mend wounds deeper than flesh. He thought of Rachel's words, spoken in the quiet after Sable's departure. "You didn't just save a life, Elliot. You let yourself be changed." He'd shrugged at the time, awkward and uncertain. But now, looking at the snowy woods and the thin rays of sun filtering through the trees, he let himself believe it. The scars he carried, the grief he'd wrapped around himself like armor, felt lighter. The world seemed full of possibility, not just pain. Nature's barriers. That too was a lesson the wild had pressed into him. The night of the blizzard had blurred the line between human and animal, between outside and in. Sable, wild and fierce, had trusted a human with the most precious thing in her world. Blaze, born to the silent language of forests, had survived because of a man's trembling hands and a doctor's quiet wisdom. Elliot understood now that the walls he'd built, around his heart, around his cabin, could not hold forever against the needs that united all living things. Hunger, fear, hope, love, these belonged to the wild as much as to humankind. He began to notice things he'd once missed: the flash of a fox at dusk, the sudden call of an owl, the hush that fell just before snowfall. He started leaving food on the porch, not just for Sable and Blaze, but for all the hungry visitors that passed through the winter woods. Sometimes, in the blue twilight, he'd see eyes glinting from the tree line, watchful, cautious, but not afraid. The valley, too, seemed to change. Word of Elliot's night with the bobcats spread. Neighbors who'd once eyed the wild with suspicion now left scraps by their sheds or paused to listen for animal calls at dusk. Children asked their parents about the paw prints by the creek. Compassion rippled outward, a quiet revolution, carving new paths through old fears. One evening, Rachel stopped by with coffee and a bag of supplies for the animals. She stood on the porch, gazing out at the silvered woods. "It's different now," she said. "You can feel it, can't you?" Elliot nodded. "I'm not the same either." She smiled, handing him the mug. "That's what the wild does. Teaches us how to endure. Reminds us that kindness isn't just a gift to others, but a gift to ourselves." They stood together, watching the last rays of sun melt into the snow. Elliot felt the lessons of that night settle into him, deep and lasting, a part of the land, as indelible as Sable's tracks. The wild had given him a story, a second chance, and a reminder that even in the coldest heart, the seed of hope can take root and bloom. Weeks passed, the mountains shedding their icy armor one sunbeam at a time. The world thawed slowly, as if nature itself was reluctant to let go of the memory of that wild, impossible night. For Elliot Shaw, each dawn felt different. The snow didn't seem so suffocating anymore, and the silence in the cabin was no longer the heavy quiet of grief, but a peace colored by hope, curiosity, and the pulse of new beginnings. He fell into a gentle rhythm, chopping wood, tending the fire, and watching the woods with a new kind of longing. Each morning, he pulled on his boots and stepped outside to scan the snowy edge of the forest, his eyes searching for movement among the shadows. And more often than not, he found what he was hoping for. Bobcat tracks, bigger ones and small, side by side, twisting around the cabin, pressed into the soft crust of new snow. Sometimes, he'd find scraps of feathers or a scattering of tiny bones, a hunter's breakfast left behind, proof that Sable was teaching Blaze all the secrets the wild demanded. There was no sign of suffering, no desperate, hungry yowls, only the quiet confidence of creatures who belonged here, who had made it through the worst winter of their lives. Elliot felt a flicker of pride every time he spotted those prints. He liked to think the bobcats remembered him, not as a threat, but as part of their story. He started leaving food outside, tucking scraps beneath the porch or along the woodpile where the snow melted slowest. Sometimes, in the blue hour before dawn, he'd catch a glimpse of Sable, a fleeting shadow, quick and powerful, her eyes glinting gold as she guided Blaze through a world that had nearly claimed him. The cub was growing fast, his limp less pronounced, his coat gleaming. Once, Elliot swore he saw them both pause at the edge of the trees. Sable's gaze met his through the thinning branches, and in that moment, a silent message passed between them. Gratitude, respect, and a trust hard-won. As the story of the blizzard night spread through the valley, something subtle began to shift. Neighbors who'd always viewed the wild as enemy territory started to listen a little closer to the sounds of the woods at night. At the feed store, folks swapped tales of animal sightings with less suspicion and more wonder. The local school teacher asked Elliot to speak to her class about what had happened, and for the first time in years, he stood in front of others and shared his story. Not just of fear and survival, but of hope and unlikely connection. He described the first knock at the door, Sable's desperate trust, Blaze's fight through the fever, and the way kindness had cracked something open in him that he'd thought was frozen shut forever. "It was the wild that taught me to care again," he told them, his voice softer than he intended. That bobcat family reminded me that the lines we draw between human and animal safety and risk can disappear when we choose to see each other with compassion. Children peppered him with questions. Were you scared? Did you touch the bobcat? Do you think she remembers you? Elliot answered everyone, smiling as the kids crowded around him, their eyes wide with wonder at the idea that a wild creature could trust a human, even for a night. His story, retold by others, took on a life of its own. More people in the valley began to look for tracks, to leave food out, to talk about their own small acts of coexistence, helping an injured bird, moving a turtle off the road, even just stopping to listen to the wind in the pines. Elliot realized that empathy, once sparked, was a fire that could spread. It was the kind of warmth that changed not just one person or one night, but an entire landscape. He noticed changes in himself, too. The heavy weight he'd carried since Jenny's passing didn't vanish, but it shifted. The ache of missing her softened, replaced by gratitude for the ways she'd taught him to love, to care, to risk his heart even when it hurt. He kept her picture on the mantel and found himself talking to her sometimes, telling her about Sable and Blaze, about Rachel's kindness and the way the world outside seemed brighter, fuller. On the coldest mornings, Elliot lingered at the window, his breath fogging the glass. Sometimes he imagined he heard Blaze's mewling cry, or Sable's low chuff, but often there was only the wind, the hush of snow falling from the branches, and the promise of life moving forward. He came to love that quiet, the way it held possibility instead of loss. Spring finally broke through the last stubborn snows, filling the forest with birdsong and green. Elliot still checked for tracks every morning. Now and then, he'd find two sets together, pressed into the mud beneath the budding birches. Once, when the morning was especially bright, he caught a glimpse of Blaze, almost grown now, watching him from the shadows, his golden eyes full of mischief and memory. Elliot grinned and tipped his hat in greeting. The young bobcat vanished into the trees, a ghost of winter, a promise kept. Looking back, Elliot knew that the blizzard night hadn't just saved Blaze, it had saved him too. The echo of kindness, one wild mother's trust, one man's refusal to turn away, had spread outward, reshaping lives, melting old fears, and planting hope where once there was only ice. Empathy, he realized, is a ripple. It moves quietly, steadily, changing everything it touches. Even now, as he watched the woods, Elliot knew the story wasn't over. Every act of compassion, no matter how small, could light a fire against the longest winter. He stood on his porch, the air fresh and bright around him, and understood at last. Kindness endures, and hope, once found, never truly leaves. There are moments in life when time seems to fold in on itself. When one winter's night, a desperate plea, and the act of opening a door become the compass points that forever change your map of the world. Elliot Shaw stood on his porch, the air fresh and sharp, gazing at the deep woods where the line between wild and human was as thin as a snowflake and as strong as a promise kept. The months since the blizzard had carried him gently forward. Spring had crept back into the valley, coaxing green shoots from beneath the old snowdrifts. Birds returned in raucous flocks. The streams sang with meltwater. The world had woken up, and so had Elliot, though he knew with a quiet certainty that he was not the same man he'd been before the storm. Sometimes, when he sat by the window sipping his morning coffee, he'd see the shadow of a bobcat slipping through the trees. Now and then, two shapes would appear, one large and sure-footed, one smaller, bounding along behind, still learning the silent language of the wild. These sightings brought a smile to Elliot's face, a private joy he carried with him through each day. He thought often of that night, the terror and the hope, the wild trust that had crossed the threshold of his home and his heart. It was proof, he realized, that compassion is not just an impulse. It is a bridge, sturdy enough to carry even the most unlikely travelers from despair to hope, from isolation to connection. He remembered the moment he held Blaze's trembling body and looked into Sable's eyes, feeling the weight of her world placed in his hands. For the first time in years, he had not turned away. As word of the Bobcat's rescue continued to ripple through the valley, more people found their own ways to reach across boundaries. Some left food for the strays that haunted the back roads. Others paused before felling a tree or clearing brush, remembering that a world lived out there, wild and vulnerable. Rachel came by with stories of new cubs and young foxes. The ranger brought news of neighbors who had taken in orphaned deer or helped a lost owl find its way. Elliot saw firsthand how one act of trust could shift the axis of an entire community. Yet for Elliot, the change was deeply personal. He had spent years hiding from his own wounds, believing that pain was best buried beneath solitude and routine. The night of the blizzard had stripped all that away, forcing him to open his door, and in doing so, open himself to the unpredictable, beautiful mess of life. Sable's eyes had demanded not just action, but presence, vulnerability, and a willingness to be changed. Now, as he walked the woods or sat in his cabin with Jenny's photo propped on the mantel, he found himself talking out loud, grateful and unafraid. "You wouldn't believe it, Jen," he'd say. "A wild bobcat trusted me. I saved her cub. Or maybe they saved me. You always said the world could surprise us if we let it." In the hush that followed, he imagined her smile, felt the warmth of her spirit in the home they'd built together, and in the lives that now moved beyond its walls. He began to write his story down, sharing it with others, not out of pride but in the hope that it might spark something in them. "For me, this wasn't just about saving a bobcat," he wrote. "It's proof that trust and compassion can bridge any gap, even between species, even between hearts broken by loss." He found meaning in the telling and in the replies he received. Letters from strangers, neighbors, and distant friends who'd read his words and dared to believe that kindness might yet change their own corner of the world. Elliot added a note to the end of his story, a gentle invitation. "If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs a sign that hope can break through the coldest winter. Or leave your own story of unlikely trust in the comments below. Because sometimes, one act of kindness is enough to change two worlds." He meant every word. He knew there were others, out there in the great, wide cold, waiting for a knock at the door, for a reason to open themselves to something new. Even now, Elliot found himself listening for those knocks, not just at his cabin, but in his heart. Sometimes the wild would answer, a bobcat's soft chuff, the brush of a tail across a snowy clearing, the fresh tracks that circled his home. Sometimes the answer was quieter, a neighbor's laughter, the hush of dawn, the easy silence between two friends on the porch. He knew, with a kind of glad certainty, that he was not alone. Not anymore. He was part of a larger story, a network of trust and hope that stretched beyond the boundaries of his grief, beyond the trees and the snow and the mountains themselves. As Elliot watched the evening settle over the valley, painting the woods in lavender and gold, he felt Jenny's presence beside him. the memory of Sable's eyes, the warmth of Blaze's tiny heartbeat against his palm. The cold might come again. Storms would always return. But the wild, he now understood, was never empty, never silent. It was always waiting, just beyond the edge of fear, ready to meet compassion with its own brand of courage. And so, with the last light of day glimmering on the snow, Elliot stood on his porch, looking out at the place where two worlds had met and become one. He listened to the quiet, felt the pulse of life in the shadows, and smiled. He was not alone. Not anymore.